During a year where we're just really starved for good new releases, I think we finally got a good one here with the latest entry in the Resident Evil series, Resident Evil Village. The long-awaited sequel to the 7th game, and one that's been thirsted over for the past few months because of that one very specific character that Capcom have shamelessly marketed the hell out of. Yeah, you know the one I'm talking about.
You ungrateful, selfish wretch!
I've had my hands on this thing for the last week or so with an early review code, and I gotta say that after beating this thing 3 times, I think it's probably one of my favourite games in the entire franchise.
Quit holding out and get to the damn point!
If Resident Evil 7 was grindhouse horror, well then Village is classic Universal Pictures horror. Instead of a backwater town in America, you've got creepy villages and castles in Europe. You got werewolves, vampires, and zombies.
Let's see how special you are.
And all these creatures crawl in search of blood to terrorize your neighborhood. This one takes place after the events in the 7th game, and at this point I am a little bit confused as to where we are in the timeline. I mean, there's so many different versions and iterations of all of these main characters that it does kind of get hard to follow.
It happened so long ago.
Without trying to spoil anything too big though, the premise is that Ethan basically finds himself in this village after a run-in with Chris Redfield, then has to go off and rescue Rose, his kidnapped daughter. There ain't no boulder punching this time though. It seems Chris has got up on the wrong side of the bed or something and is about as much fun to be around as a dumpster fire. But there is a reason for that, and that's because this village happens to be ground zero for some kind of epidemic that's turned all of the locals into creatures resembling werewolves. With the remaining few survivors banded together and having a shorter life expectancy than a housefly.
Tomorrow we'll all be dead.
And this is the backdrop for our poor protagonist Ethan, who returns once again to reprise his role as one of the series' most resilient punching bags. I mean, goddamn son, the amount of punishment and injuries this guy has to go through is just on another level.
Now, let's take a look at him.
This really does feel like the beginning of an entirely new saga though, and it definitely creates more questions than it does answers. It's going to explain a few plot elements from the 7th game, but kind of seems to me that they're really making it very clear that there's going to be more games in this storyline.
What kind of sick medieval shit is this?
There's been some pretty big comparisons to Resident Evil 4 made throughout the course of the game's development, and I don't think that's inaccurate either. I mean, right off the bat, you get some pretty obvious RE4 vibes. You're in a creepy looking European village and within minutes, you're then getting attacked by the hostile locals. You even then have to barricade yourself in a house, and you also find the shotgun early on too.
Okay.
But it's also got a few other hallmarks of RE4. I mean, you've got the merchant, for instance.
I am but a humble merchant.
Who forms exactly the same function, and there's even a cool Easter egg where he references the 4th game with a bit of idle dialogue.
What are you buying? Just something an old friend of mine used to say. Thank you.
The merchant sells items, but more importantly weapon upgrades, and also allows you to sell all the various pieces of treasure you find.
And buy it I will.
You'll even be looking out for glistening icons throughout the environment to indicate treasure you can shoot down and collect. It's classic. Even one of the late game enemies is kinda similar to the regenerators, with these very specific weak spots you have to target to actually damage them. Village even has chickens running around too, which I assumed were gonna lay eggs like they did in the 4th game, but what you're actually supposed to do is hunt these things, along with pigs and fish for their meat, so the merchant can give you permanent upgrades.
Finished. I'd love for you to enjoy as well.
But that's really only cutting into a small slice of what's a pretty big and varied pie.
And now let the games begin!
Now look, you can't blame Capcom for the way they've handled the marketing for this, in the way that they've pretty much only shown footage of Lady Dimitrescu, in the way that they've pretty much only shown footage of Lady Dimitrescu, or Lady D as I'm calling her because it's easier to pronounce. In fact, maybe I should be calling her Lady Double D. Has anyone made that joke yet?
Starting to go a little stale.
Anyway, she just continues the series-long trend of including sexually charged character designs that kinda makes it unclear if the player's supposed to be concerned or aroused. But the thing is, they really did make it seem like she's the be-all and end-all, but you'll soon discover that isn't really the case. Lady D might be a bad bitch, but she's only one bad bitch out of 4 bad bitches in total. You see, the village has got 4 powerful lords that kinda serve as lieutenants for this deity figure named Mother Miranda. You've got Lady D, you've got Heisenberg, Moreau, and Donna. The village itself acts more like a hub, and you're coming back here throughout the whole game, getting new weapons and items, and unlocking the various routes throughout the village to track down each of these main antagonists. You can even run from one end of the map to the other without so much as a loading screen. And it's pretty cool having this seamless, uninterrupted game world. I mean, we've come a long way since those door loading screens every 5 seconds.
What kind of sick medieval shit is this?
Now, Lady D's whole chapter is just really classic Resident Evil. You've got a creepy castle with a bunch of locked doors, you've got dungeons full of zombies, hidden passages, and then a super powerful, invincible tyrant-like character with Lady D who's pursuing you almost the entire goddamn time.
Stupid man thing!
Sadly though, she can't be stunned like Mr. X or Nemesis can, and she doesn't drop any kind of unique loot or gear for attacking her.
Are you kidding?
But the worst you can do to her is just knock her hat slightly off kilter, which appears to be only a minor annoyance.
You've dirtied my dress!
I think this whole section though is easily the highlight of the game though, even if the puzzles here aren't much more than just bring this item to this area. The entire bottom floor is this creepy wine cellar where you gotta wade through ankle deep bodily fluid while these zombie things pop out to ambush you. Then you're moving across the icy roofs of the castle and there's flying gargoyle creatures flapping about. It's just a dope atmosphere that's a cool and unique take on that classic Resident Evil formula of being stuck in a singular location as you slowly unlock and uncover all of these secrets. The biggest disappointment here though are the witches. These are Lady D's vampire daughters and I find these things disappointing because you can't actually kill them unless it's during one of these scripted encounters.
This can't be!
They'll show up during key points to mess around with you, but as far as I can tell, your only strategy is to haul ass because you can't actually kill them. It's only during these specific scripted moments when they're exposed to sunlight that you can actually damage them and ultimately kill them. But I mean, at that point, it doesn't really offer up any challenge because they're at a considerable disadvantage. You know, being vampires and all that and having that extreme allergic reaction to sunlight. Still though, seeing everything there is to do here is only really going to take you the better part of 2 or 3 hours, and then that's it. You're on to the next one. Lady D and her inhuman waistline are just a thing of the past, and I can't help but feel they played that card way too early. Because despite how cool and interesting these other characters are, I don't know man, you can't really compete with a 7-foot tall vampire lady giving off some serious Angelica Houston vibes. Yeah, look, if the folks at Capcom weren't at least influenced somewhat by old school Angelica Houston, then I don't know what's real anymore. I don't want to outright show and spoil the other bosses, but I will just say that for one of these, you don't even use any weapons against it. I mean, it's a borderline QuickTime event. In that one's defense though, it does have one of the most fucked up moments in any Resident Evil game I think I've ever played. And anyone who spoils that sequence for you deserves to get a colonoscopy with a cactus. Another one involves running around a small arena using the ammo up for all of your best weapons as you pump round after round into its weak spot. So yeah, classic Resident Evil boss. And then the final one is so ludicrous that it almost feels like something out of an entirely different game. Followed by Miranda as the final boss, and let me just say at that point, I hope you've saved up all of your Magnum rounds because, yeah, you're gonna need them, bitch. Like all of the recent Resident Evil games, this one is also pretty damn good to look at, and the sheer amount of detail this engine's able to pull off is just kind of staggering. Some of those environments that you move through in Lady D's castle just look amazing. It's some of the most artistic and aesthetically pleasing stuff I've seen in recent memory. Those areas where you've only got your flashlight to illuminate the way ahead kind of looks like you're playing through found footage in real time, and all that's missing is VHS scan lines and shaky cam. The village really does look like this run-down, dilapidated war zone. There's overturned vehicles and piles of garbage in the streets.
What happened?
And inside these houses, the furniture is strewn around the room, with streaks of blood indicating the horrible struggles that have unfolded. I mean, even just the character models, like some of them are so highly detailed. It's really starting to bridge that gap between real-time visuals and pre-rendered CGI.
What are you talking about?
You can see this smears of makeup on Lady D's gigantic boobs, for instance, and you combine it with that soft depth of field when aiming down the sights and during some of the cinematics, and it's really like someone strapped a GoPro to Ethan's head or something. Yeah, you can see the odd sloppy texture work here and there, and if you're the kind of person who worries about grass physics, well, then you probably have a field day staring at individual blades. But the overall picture is great, and it captures that feeling of classic film horror vibes.
You don't have to trust my word.
Thankfully too, Resident Evil Village also has some pretty good shooting. Despite having all the hallmarks of survival horror, Ethan's still able to walk around with a kind of arsenal that would make most boomer shooter protagonists grin with envy. Avoiding enemies is entirely possible and probably advised at some times, but on standard and hardcore difficulty, I reckon you've got more than enough ammo to kill pretty much everything. Not to mention, it's also kind of encouraged because enemies often drop treasure. Treasure equals cash, and cash equals weapon upgrades, which equals better guns, which equals easier kills and easier treasure. Assuming of course your aim isn't trash. Off the back of that too, I think there needs to be a pretty big disclaimer about this game, in that I'd imagine it would be considerably easier with a mouse and a keyboard. As always, headshots are the way to go, and although enemies have a habit of ducking and weaving here more than Muhammad Ali, it's not too hard to maintain decent accuracy with the mouse. With a controller though, well, I can definitely see this being a pain in the ass against some of the more nimble enemies. I mean, those flying gargoyle things, for instance, kind of look like what happens when someone loses their connection to the server and starts rubber banding all over the place. It just feels more natural playing a first-person shooter with the mouse and the keyboard. And I'm not trying to be elitist by saying that, it's just trying to precise aim in a shooter with a controller is like trying to pick up grains of rice while wearing boxing gloves. Later on in the game, during a sequence that I can only refer to as Call of Resident Evil, it's absolutely dreadful, throwing dozens of enemies at you. But still, with the mouse and the keyboard, it wasn't all that much of a hassle. Why am I saying all of this? Well, because I think the platform you play on is really going to dictate how you fare with the combat in this game, for better or worse.
You don't have to trust my words.
When it comes to the guns, you've got all of the returning champions. You start off with a pistol, which is about as useful as a spud gun, and continues that tradition in these games where they make it that even with a pistol in your hands, you still feel completely unarmed. Then you've got the shotgun, the sniper rifle, the grenade launcher, and of course the Magnum. The Magnum in this is a huge-ass revolver that looks like the kind of thing the DEA would confiscate from some kind of Mexican cartel leader's mansion during a drug raid. But even better than all of that are the endgame weapons, the stuff you get right near the end of the campaign that's so expensive that it outright motivates you to replay through the game in New Game Plus mode, just to unlock, upgrade, and play around with them. Yeah, avert thine eyes until this time code if you don't want to have this stuff spoiled, but I do want to say that there is some fun weapons here that you can eventually unlock. I'm not going to tell you how you can actually unlock them, but you do get that auto mag returning from Resident Evil 7. You can also unlock a hand cannon that uses sniper rounds and even a rocket pistol. Yeah, rocket pistol, but still don't quite understand the point of this thing. It just continues that tradition of having more stuff to unlock than you could possibly manage in a single playthrough. And I appreciate that.
This simple modification can be done in just a moment.
Because one of the best aspects for me to these games is going back through them armed to the teeth like you're John Wick committing bioweapon genocide. One of my main complaints here with the shooting though is that for one of the main enemy types, it seems that critical headshots aren't even possible. And it's like they weren't even animated in or something. You're only really fighting two main enemies here. You've got the Lycans, or these zombie looking things, and the Lycans' heads on the one hand explode nicely, like a watermelon dropped off the side of a building. But yet, despite my best efforts, and believe me I tried, I just couldn't get those zombie heads to pop, and it's a bit disappointing. Because waiting for an enemy to get into point blank range before then sending their entire head to the Shadow Realm is one of the most fun aspects to the combat in these games. And also Capcom, please use some kind of text for the health indicator. Have it say it's in a caution or a danger state, because I'm red-green colorblind as shit and I can't see the difference. It's also probably worth mentioning the lack of variety with these enemy types. I mean, outside of those Lycans and the zombies, there's not really that much else going on here. A lot of the late game enemies really just come down to whether or not you've micromanaged your ammo to the point that you've got enough left to take them all out. And it really does feel like they ran out of ideas because they're just tougher variants of the basic enemies, with some kind of gimmick or a specific weak spot you need to target. There's no spiders, there's no crows, no bats, no plants, no dogs outside of a couple of werewolves, and there's no hunters either. Though to be honest, I could probably do without those guys, because hunters are about as fun as trying to stick your genitals into a mouse trap.
Hey, don't talk like that.
And I think as a result, because the strategy for most enemies just involves waiting for them to be in optimal range, you become used to that gameplay loop very early on, and it means that it ends up being a pretty easy game, especially by Resident Evil standards. Standard mode, as an example, isn't even all that challenging. I played through the entire game in this mode forgetting I even had a block button, mostly because I just didn't need it. I was able to keep enemies at bay the majority of the time, and on the off chance that something did grab me and take a piece out of me, I could just easily craft that magical healing water, pour it all over my hand and cure myself of all of my ailments. Hardcore mode was definitely a bit more challenging, but still not entirely unbeatable. The only truly challenging difficulty mode here is the last one, Village of Shadows, but even this is kinda forgiving in a major way. Because it allows you to save your game whenever you want, it doesn't include the advent of the ink ribbons. Not to mention, it also includes checkpoints before those major sequences, like in the boss fights. Still though, this mode's going to grind your nuts down to a fine powder. Enemies are a lot tougher, not to mention faster, and there's even stronger variants of them thrown in with the normal ones. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing people speedrun this, because I can't even imagine how you'd beat this on a new save file without any of the upgraded weapons. I went into this mode off the back of my hardcore save file with my guns carried across, and even then, the enemies just soaked up bullets like it was little more than a slap on the ass. So I guess my point is that at least the hardcore fans can take solace knowing that there is a real challenge here waiting for them.
Shut your damn hole!
One of my minor issues with this game though, and it's also an issue I have with a lot of these modern games, is this kind of stylized input delay, where it takes like half a second or so to register your movement sometimes. It's a big part of why I could never get into Red Dead Redemption 2. I mean, it felt like I was controlling someone walking around underwater. And I get why they've done this. It's a means of trying to emulate the fact that you're playing as someone who's got a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs, as opposed to just being a pair of floating arms and eyes. I get it. It's not as bad in Village, but it is noticeable at times, and it can seriously handicap you during gameplay, especially when you're trying to move quickly to avoid taking damage. It also reminded me how much I hate how these games limit your movement speed when your health is critical. And again, I get it. You're injured and you're not able to move around as fast. But from a gameplay perspective, you might as well put your ass on a silver plate at that point and just outright offer it up to the enemies. It'd be like playing Doom Eternal, and when you get low on health, you can't run around anymore and instead have to walk everywhere. You know what had happened there? Yeah, you'd get killed.
Time to die.
Either way though, the A-Team at Capcom have come back once again to give us a pretty damn solid entry into one of the most resilient survival horror series of all time. It's got something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. You've got an 8 or so hour long campaign, there's heaps of stuff to play around with through all the unlockable content, the Mercenaries mode, and probably the inevitable DLC. Lastly, they just need to add in some kind of VR mode where I can get hugs from Lady D, and then I'll die a happy man.
Oh, be careful what you wish for, Ethan Winters.